Hello, and welcome back to the Caliphs, the rise and fall of Arab power. My name is Zaid Wahab, and today we're going to conclude our historical exploration. Both the Caliphate and the Abbasids endure beyond the end of our narrative, but the long decline we've been following will finally culminate in another dynasty subduing the ruling clan and subsuming its legitimacy. This transformational political event marks a new era and coincides with the conclusion of al-Mas'udi's history, the last of this show's three primary sources. Episode 89, Al-Muttaqi, Al-Mustakfi, and Al-Muti'. This is it, ladies and gentlemen, the end of the road. Abbasid power could only plummet for so long before hitting rock bottom. A mere generation ago, it took us all of 4 episodes to cover the reign of Al-Muqtadir, worst of his line. While he was cataclysmically bad for the Ummah, his station was the locus of real power in the land, making it worthwhile to study his circumstances as closely as we could. As Bob Dylan says in one of his songs, "We used to care, but things have changed." Ever since the inception of the role of Supreme Commander, the potency and importance of the Caliph had shriveled away. This process had progressed to such a degree that we can now comfortably fit 3 Abbasid successors in a single episode, all in the span of only 4 short years. Things were quite volatile the last time we covered Iraq, so let me open with a short refresher on how things stood when we left them. In 942, Al-Muttaqi was championed back to his court in Baghdad by the Hamdanids of Mesopotamia and Tuzun's Turks. Together, they expelled the Baridis from the capital and chased them back towards the south. Within a year or so, Hassan ibn Hamdan, the Caliphate's supreme commander, retreated to his city of Mosul, separating those loyal to him from the rest of the army. It's clear that something had spooked him. Some accounts claim that he felt he could no longer trust Tuzun, and feared a mutiny by this commander's Turks could cost him his life. Others say it was because the Caliphate was too broke to pay anyone, and there was widespread discontent aimed at the Hamdanid since he was Amir al-Umara. In any case, Tuzun marched back to Baghdad in June 943 and was promptly declared the Caliphate's new supreme commander by the Caliph. Thus appointed, Tuzun paid no heed to the Hamdanids in the north and marched his men back south so he could face the Baridis before they had a chance to reorganize their forces. When Tuzun left Baghdad, he sent his chief secretary to the royal court and tasked him with managing the state and the caliph until his return. This alienated Al-Muttaqi, who was desperately trying to restore some semblance of authority to the caliph's office. In an ill-fated gambit, Al-Muttaqi reached out to Hassan ibn Hamdan, asking him to come back to Baghdad and rescue him from the tyranny of Tuzun's secretary. Maybe the idea was that Tuzun would lose a good chunk of his armies fighting the Baridis in the south, and that partnering with the Hamdanids behind his back was the smart thing to do. It's hard to say. The Hamdanid army showed up in Baghdad, prompting Tuzun's secretary to go into hiding. It did not enter the capital, however. It merely escorted the caliph out to Tikrit. To the surprise of both Al-Muttaqi and the Hamdanids, it wasn't too long before Tuzun showed up with an even larger force than he'd left with. See, the Baridis had made their earliest forays into politics by backing Ibn Ra'iq and helping him take Wasit in 935. only for him to betray them as soon as he became supreme commander. The rich Basran family tried again with Bajgam in 938, while he was tasked with invading them for the second time, no less. A daughter was married off to cement that relationship, but it still soured into recriminations a few short years later. It seems like Abu Abdullah al-Baridi's ambition knew no bounds, for he was quick to ally with Tuzun, even giving him the hand of another of his daughters in marriage. The general had already begun his slow return to Baghdad when he heard news of all that had gone down in his absence, and so he marched his reinforced army to meet the Hamdanids in Tikrit. Tuzun readily won that battle, forcing the caliph and his defenders to retreat to Mosul. The Hamdanids then fought and lost again, this time dangerously close to their own capital. They thought it best to end hostilities and began to negotiate with Tuzun in early 944. The caliph was tangential to this conflict. Tuzun only wanted them to drop any claims they had to lands outside Mesopotamia in return for recognition as independent tributaries of their own domain. The Hamdanids had to sweeten the pot a little because of the military disadvantage they currently found themselves at. After agreeing to pay much higher taxes, the talks were concluded successfully in May 944, bringing peace to northern Iraq. Al-Muttaqi had relocated to Raqqa during these negotiations, and he wrote to the governor of Egypt and Syria, Muhammad ibn Tughj al-Ikhshid. The fact that he called himself Ikhshid reveals that he was of Sogdian descent, as this was the title of honor around the Ferghana Valley, similar to how the Isbahbad was the king of Tabaristan and the Shahanshah the ruler of the Persian Empire. The Ikhshid wasted no time in assembling an army and meeting the caliph in Raqqa, where he invited him to hold court in Egypt over and over again. It would have been wise of Al-Muttaqi to truly consider this proposal. While there were no guarantees that he would be any less of a caged bird with the Ikhshid, the Egyptians had no reason to mistreat him, and more crucially, had good reason not to mistreat the caliph, as he would be the only Abbasid in their land. Tuzun had already showed his tyrannical leanings, and unlike the Ikhshid, had access to as many Abbasid alternatives as he liked. Al-Muttaqi was eventually swayed by Tuzun's repeated vows of having turned over a new leaf, one full of reverence for the stature of the caliph, and in late August 944 made his way back to his court in Baghdad. Tuzun met the caliph's entourage a short ride outside the capital. He got off his horse and kissed the ground before them. Al-Muttaqi told his supreme commander that there was no need for such formalities between them, and asked him to get back on his steed. Tuzun refused, however, and insisted on accompanying his liege on foot. He led him to a small encampment his men had prepared, and placed his entire retinue under arrest. Like his uncle Al-Qahir, Al-Muttaqi was violently blinded. He was then led to the palace and forced to pledge to a cousin of his, Abdullah ibn al-Muqtafi, who was dubbed al-Mustakfi. A title meant more in reference to his father than for the meaning implied by its convoluted conjugation. So if al-Muqtafi billah is he who is content with God, al-Mustakfi billah is he who strives for contentment with God. I say his father is more relevant because al-Mustakfi's elevation was the one to abandon al-Muqtadir's line, which al-Radi and al-Muttaqi descended from. Anyway, the 36-year-old al-Mustakfi became caliph in September 944, meaning al-Muttaqi had ruled for a little over 4 years, some of which he was actually out of Baghdad doing his own thing. Al-Mustakfi would never know such freedom. He was installed by Tuzun and ordered to stay in the palace and do absolutely nothing. Tuzun wasn't going anywhere either. He had defended against a couple difficult invasions by the Buwayhids, who had attacked Baghdad earlier that year while the last caliph was gallivanting across Syria. Tuzun only managed to fend them off by destroying the main bridges that allowed large numbers of people to enter and exit the capital. This thwarted the enemy, and the Buwayhids retreated to nearby Wasit, where they bade their time awaiting their next opportunity. Tuzun was quite certain that his presence in the city was all that kept them at bay. In this he was right, and we can say that for sure because they swept in as soon as he passed away a year later in August of 945. The caliphate's command structure had been so hollowed out that Tuzun's secretary, a man with absolutely no experience at war, was dubbed Amir al-Umara for a spell. He understood the position he was in, however, and he immediately wrote to Ahmad ibn Buwayh, inviting him to take up the mantle of defender of the caliph's realm. Buwayhid armies ferried into Baghdad in December of that year, and al-Mustakfi immediately made Ahmad his latest supreme commander. Ironically, Ahmad was the youngest Buwayhid, so he could not accurately be described as commander of all commanders. The grandiose title fit the eldest brother, Ali ibn Buwayh, best, and so he ultimately adopted it instead. Now that the Buwayhids have officially taken charge of the caliphate, let's give them a long overdue introduction. You know, it's probably more correct to call them Buyids and not Buwayhids. I went with the latter because that's what they're called in Arab sources. It all hinges on how you pronounce their patriarch's name, whether it's Buya or Buwayh. Writing it out in Arabic would lead readers to assume the latter, and so Arabs came to call them Buwayhids. In any case, Buya, or Buwayh, wasn't a historical figure himself. He was a simple fisherman. The dynasty which carried his name was founded by his three sons, Ali, Hassan, and Ahmad ibn Buwayh. The family lived in Daylam, on the southeastern shore of the Caspian Sea. Ali, the eldest of the three, was the first to enter military service, enlisting with the Samanid armies. He rose up the ranks and was assigned to the governor of Rai, around modern-day Tehran, so a few hundred kilometers west of his home. He was joined by his two brothers, and not only were all three competent commanders, but they proved to work remarkably well as a unit too. This was around the time the caliphate was collapsing, so in the late 920s. Yusuf ibn Abbasid, who had governed Azerbaijan for the Abbasids, had met an unexpected death at the hands of the Qaramita in Iraq, and the entire southern Caspian was aflame with independence movements, which clashed with each other even more than they did their occupiers. The Buwayhid dynasty was forged in the fires of these wars. I'm not going to go through their story in detail. The brothers joined Mardawij when he founded the Ziyarid dynasty, and he promoted them to minor governors in their own right. After a while, he came to view them as a threat, and tried to eliminate the sons of Buya. Although he had the upper hand, their position along the decaying Abbasid state gave them plenty of easy targets. They found that those living to their south and west were eager to ally with them to oust the defunct caliphate. Their first major conquest was the rich city of Isfahan, and it is said that they found a stupendous amount of hidden treasure, wealth pilfered by the Abbasid officials whom they had just replaced. Over the next few years, they left the Caspian behind and inched further south towards Faris, taking its capital Shiraz in 934. When Mardawij was murdered by Bechgam in early 935, the Buwayhids no longer had to worry about the threat from the north. They expanded even further south into Khuzestan, fought with and against the Baridis of Basra, and eventually came into conflict with the caliphate proper as it slowly but steadily imploded. The conquest of Iraq wasn't a primary goal for the Buwayhids. In fact, Ahmad had only been sent there after he failed to take Kirman. Expanding east into Sistan and preparing for a showdown against the almighty Samanids were more pressing priorities than bullying the Abbasids. Despite the caliph's lack of standing, being able to act in his name still held considerable symbolic power and bestowed popular legitimacy across the Ummah. With the exception of Andalusia and Northwest Africa, Muslims everywhere called prayers in the name of the Abbasid caliph. Congregants mentioned the Abbasid ruler across Egypt, Greater Syria, the Arabian Peninsula, Mesopotamia, Iraq, and all the way east to Samanid Bukhara. That's why the Hamdanids, the Baridis, the Ikhshid, and now the Buwayhids had all vied for the role of Amir al-Umara. Ahmad ibn Buwayh had come out on top, making his family's dynasty the officially sanctioned masters of the caliphate. There was just one last detail to address, however. The Buwayhids wanted it to be clear to everyone that they were in charge, not just effectively, but absolutely. Being dubbed Supreme Commander by the Caliph was a start, but it left room for the tiniest bit of misinterpretation. As the man who had appointed them, one could argue that al-Mustakfi was the true power in the land. Although it was a feeble argument, the mere fact that he predated their legitimacy seemed to be too much to bear. Their only course of action was to install their own Abbasid. Nothing less would do. But wait, why restrict themselves to Abbasids? There's an interesting, if possibly apocryphal, account about such deliberations, well worth a minute of our time. The Buwayhids themselves could never become caliphs. It was a well-established tradition by this point that only a descendant of Quraysh, the tribe of the Prophet, could claim the title. Since the Buwayhids were from Daylam, their entire region had been steeped in Shiite ideology, as the Hashemites who had escaped al-Mansur's persecution back in the late 8th century had been the first to spread Islam in the region. We are told that Ahmad ibn Buwayh considered replacing the Abbasids with a direct descendant of the Prophet. The reply he got from his advisor was, and I quote, "Today you have a caliph whom you and your companions see as undeserving, and if you ordered them to kill him, they would do so without hesitation. If you place a descendant of the Prophet on the throne, one whom you and your companions view as legitimate, they would be obliged to heed his command should he ever seek to spill your blood." Upon hearing this, the Supreme Commander relented, and sufficed himself with replacing one Abbasid for another. In January 946, about a month after entering Baghdad, Ahmad ibn Buwayh ordered the blinding and removal of al-Mustakfi. Some sources say he accused the caliph of plotting against the Buwayhids, but there's no reason to believe such obviously empty propaganda. Al-Fadl, a 33-year-old son of al-Muqtadir, replaced his cousin as caliph, and was given the telling title al-Muti' lillah, he who is obedient to God. His role was absolutely devoid of any responsibility. This impotence wasn't all bad, however, for it ensured al-Muti' a long reign, as there was nothing to be gained from replacing him. His reign lasted a record 29 years. His successor managed 17, the Abbasid after that 41, and the last Buwayhid-era Abbasid reigned a whopping 44 years, surviving the downfall of their state. But all that history is beyond our scope. Al-Mas'udi doesn't have much to say about Al-Mustakfi, and he ends the one page he has on Al-Muti' by writing that he can't be expected to give as detailed a picture of his reign because it was still ongoing. In fact, it had just begun, as Al-Mas'udi completed his book in 947, only 1 year into the Buwayhid age. He passed away 9 years later in 956. But you know what? We have a little more time on our hands today, so we might as well play the Abbasids all the way off the stage of history. The Abbasids were almost always pawns of a more powerful dynasty, starting with the Buwayhids. They ruled for over a century until about 1055. Then came the Seljuks, a Turco-Persian dynasty hailing from the shores of the now dried-up Aral Sea in Central Asia. They ruled Iraq for another 100 years, until a Abbasid caliph managed to marshal an army capable of defeating the Seljuks and wresting control of Baghdad in 1157. It took another 70 years for the dynasty to win back the rest of Iraq. But by then, a new terror was already brewing in the east, one greater than any that had preceded it. In 1258, the Mongols destroyed Baghdad and put an end to the Abbasids, or just about. What happened was that one genuine Abbasid survived. He had been imprisoned by the caliph at the time, somehow managed to escape in the chaos of a jailbreak, and miraculously found refuge with a nomadic Arab tribe he chanced upon in the desert. He remained in hiding for 3 years, and only emerged in Cairo in 1261 after the ruling Mamalik had managed to rebuff the invading Mongol army. To great fanfare, the Sultan declared the revival of the Abbasid dynasty. The new caliph immediately set out on a campaign to retake his capital, but his valiant forces were butchered by the Mongols in Central Asia that same year. Of the several thousand who accompanied the caliph, only about 50 managed to escape the battle. And wouldn't you know it, one of them swore up and down that he was also a secret Abbasid. His claim was accepted by the Mamalik a year later, probably because it had a stabilizing and legitimizing effect on the ruling dynasty, and the newly minted caliph lived the rest of his years in Cairo. Neither he nor any of his descendants ever held political or military power. They persisted in a vaguely religious role for about 2.5 centuries, until the Mamalik of Egypt were defeated by the Ottoman Turks in 1517. That's when the caliph and his family were relocated to Constantinople. The quote-unquote Abbasids are said to have bequeathed the mantle of caliphate and its responsibilities to the Ottomans, presenting the new sultan with holy relics used by the Prophet himself. It should be noted that this last bit, with the passing of the baton, doesn't appear in any historical records until about the late 18th century. So just as the problems of the Ottoman Empire were becoming hard to ignore, and a new sheen of religious legitimacy was required. I suppose it's more accurate to say that they don't appear in Arabic until then. I can't be sure if or when they were disseminated in Ottoman Turkish. Okay, we are now scratching the bottom of the historical barrel, so to speak. So let's wrap up, even if it is a little earlier than usual. Although this is our final narrative episode, it won't be the last time you hear from me. I'm planning to release one more in which we'll reflect on our journey through Arab history. It's not that there's much left to say, but I believe there's benefit to reviewing the dynasty, maybe even comparing it to the one it had supplanted in the 8th century. Maybe we'll even reflect on more abstract topics, pulling away from medieval history and towards definitions of political power and social legitimacy. As you can probably tell, I'm not exactly sure what we'll cover yet. But I invite you to join me one last time, here on the Caliphs, the rise and fall of Arab power.